Hello to all viewers of this microbiology instruction PowerPoints. This is video 7, and I am going to talk about how microbes get transmitted from their natural reservoir to you, the host. And basically, we're going to be looking at how the potential for an infection is raised because the organism is moving from where it naturally occurs, causing no problems, and entering the host, your body, where it has a very big chance of causing an infection unless your immune system fights back, unless your immune system is strong enough to fight back, which in many cases is what happens, but there are some other situations where, of course, the organism takes over. So with that, the first slide is listing the 3 major ways that microbes get transmitted to you. The first way is by contact, and we're going to look at different types of contact. You come in contact with a reservoir where those organisms naturally live. A second way is they can be brought to you by a carrier. By that we mean some living organism that we call a vector carries the microbe, often on its little legs like a tick or a fly, or the vector can be a mosquito which sucks the blood of someone who is infected, or the fluid from an area where the organism lives, and then bites you, and by that method transmits the pathogen to you, to your blood. And the third general way is the organism is transmitted to you by a non-living carrier. In the earlier cases, a living carrier we call a vector, but in this third way, it's a non-living carrier, and we call these vehicles, not the motor cars that you drive, but vehicles, means of transmitting that organism. And again, we'll look into more detail at all these 3 major ways that microbes get transmitted. So with that, we'll move on to the next slide, slide number 2. And it just basically tells you regardless of where that organism came from, regardless of the source or reservoir of that microbe, those organisms can become infectious when they enter your body, again, with a lot of factors involved causing playing a role. The transmission is the spreading of the microbe, but the infection is when your body is overwhelmed by the number of organisms that have invaded you. So with that, slide number 3, we start looking at the different ways that these microbes get transmitted. The first way is by contact, and in slide 3, I'm listing one type of contact. We call this the direct contact. Again, people who have pets, they like to have their pets show their love by licking them and kiss your little puppy. If the pet has been vaccinated, has received its shot, probably you don't have as big a chance of having any microbe passed on to you. But there are other cases where it is a real possibility. And that is one of the reasons why there's a strong push. If you have a pet, make sure that it gets all it is shots, so you don't get those infections. Because these pets, yes, even if they have been vaccinated, they run outside in your yard and they sniff at all kinds of objects, and there's a chance that in some of those the grass, the trees, the pavement in your driveway, they could pick up something that is naturally living in those areas. But if they pick it up, they can pass it on to you. Slide number 4 is another type of contact. We call this direct contact. It's also direct contact, but in this case, is that through food, various foods that are grown. As an example, you see tomatoes there being grown. On the left side, some kind of low-lying vegetable, probably lettuce or spinach. Now, the main way that you could get an infection passed on to you, if those fields are being irrigated by water, which often happens, and that irrigation water gets contaminated, let's say by animal waste that maybe has run into that irrigation water, or there's a sewer breakup, and the contaminated sewer water runs into the fields. So you're again going to get the contact. If you eat those vegetables, the tomatoes or the spinach or the lettuce, then that is how that microbe, contaminated water, is going to get passed on to you. Slide number 5, another means of contact transmission. In this case, it's indirect. Again, you see people in the elevators, you touch the elevator rail. That rail may have been in contact with someone who was infected, and the organisms are stuck on that railing. Doorknobs is another bigger notorious inanimate surface that can cause that can be a source of contact transmission. Toys are big. You have a kindergarten, kids are playing with the toys, they're not always as careful. Again, you can have contamination that way. You have infected waste, infected needles, maybe infected knife, infected scalpel, and that's another way that an infection can be passed on to you. Slide number 6. This is another means of contact transmission. This is the one that has been big in the news over the last 2 years, especially droplet contact through sneezing, through talking, which is the main reason why we have to wear our masks, because COVID and many other airborne infections are very easily transmitted from one person to another through droplets when you sneeze, when you're talking, and that's how the infection can be passed on from one person to another. Okay, we have looked at the 3 types of contact transmission. Now let's look at another type of transmission, and this time we said via a living carrier that we call a vector. In other words, it's a living organism. It can be arthropods, various types of arthropods like fleas, ticks, mosquitoes. And again, this gives you an example. It could be a mosquito biting you, or it could be a fly that has a little small microorganism on its legs, passing that onto that hot dog you're eating in the backyard, and then you bite into the hot dog and you pick up the microbe that the fly left in your hot dog. Slide 7 is another example of transmission, in this case through vehicles or vehicular transmission. In this case, the carriers are not living. So you have, for example, airborne. Here's a waste dump. Of course, the air is going to be full of organisms from that dump site. You have an industrial pollution. Any kind of organism that is coming through the air with that is going to be passed on to you. Another very common example, if you're in a big city and you're driving behind a big garbage truck, or even any other truck, they stir up the air, and if you end up breathing that air, any contamination that is coming at you from behind that truck could have microorganisms, and they can be passed on to you. Another example, this is on slide 10. We have another example of non-living carriers or vehicular transmission. In this case, we're talking about waterborne, contaminated water. Contaminated water is a big, big, big source of transmission of microorganisms, especially in areas where people are poor and they don't have good water supply systems. They can get water from wherever they happen to find it, and you can see those little kids. They definitely picking up water that has a very, very high risk of having organisms that naturally live in that water. But if you drink that water, then those organisms are going to become pathogenic. Slide 10, again, another example of vehicular carrier transmission. In this case, we're talking about foodborne. There's some microbes that are live in poultry or birds, and you can definitely pass them on. She is cutting some chicken or some other meat, and any organism that might be in that meat could be passed on to you, especially if the cutting board was not washed properly or the meat was not cooked completely to kill the organism. So there you go again. In the chicken or in the cow, that microbe may have been normally living there, causing no problems, but when it's passed on to you, then it becomes a problem. Salmonella is a big example of that. You get a lot of salmonella poisoning from chicken that has the salmonella organism, and the chicken was not cooked properly, or the cutting board where they cut the chicken was not cleaned properly. So in summary, in slide 11, the take-home message transmission is we do need to know how to avoid the picking up these microbes that are these pathogens. But in order to know how to avoid the transmission, of course, we need to know what are the ways that they're going to get transmitted. So if the transmission is by contact, make sure you avoid or reduce the contact. For example, you either make sure you wash your hands afterwards, have clean. If it's by vector, kill the vector, and that is why they have various sprays. They talk about, if you're standing water in your yard, make sure that water is either or sprayed so there are no mosquitoes growing in it, because they definitely could pass on not only it could be West Nile fever and pathogens. If it's an inanimate vehicle, remove the contaminated inanimate vehicle. If you have contaminated water, remove. If it's air, make sure that you're not exposed to that contaminated air. If it's inanimate objects like kitchen knife, something, make sure they're clean surfaces, that they're properly disinfected and cleaned, which is another reason in many microbiology labs. When I'm teaching microbiology labs, I make sure the students remember to disinfect their benches before and after. That is reducing the chances of picking up any microbes that might be lying on the bench. That's an inanimate surface where organisms can thrive. And if we avoid any of those sources of transmission, we go a long way towards minimizing the chance of getting infected.